Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. There are various things I've been seeing indications are relevant for me to address at this time. I suspect various individuals were expecting me to go pick fights and yell at people, whether online and or offline, over these things. I see no adequate reason to behave like that, beyond recognizing extremely clearly that it wouldn't actually be productive or beneficial to me. It sincerely doesn't emotionally resonate with me either. Although there certainly are circumstances I find it appropriate to yell in, a situation like what I've been hearing is the reality of why my life is in the state it's currently in, most certainly isn't such a circumstance. From what I've been hearing, this should be a rather potent indication and demonstration of the reality of my personality as further irrefutable evidence of me being a vastly different individual than that which I've been getting portrayed as being by many for various reasons. Beyond even indications of specific individuals, I've been seeing extremely strange implications in my energy about some kind of cult-like group called the First 48. It's led me to draw the connection that something related to the first 48 of something has been an energy extremely intensively and extensively existentially assaulting me and generally violating my boundaries and energy. I suspect there might be various in reality egregious false narratives being purported about me in relation to specifically the significance or meaning of the first 48 releases I've made on this podcast. There might perhaps also be egregious false narratives about me in relation to what I've been planning and how I've perceived what the first 48 years of my life should look like or involve experiences related to. Perhaps there are even false narratives of me being part of and or somehow involved with a group of 48 entities or energies that have been acting with malice towards others that I, in reality, never consented to or even would ever generally validate under any circumstances. I've now seen reason to suspect one of my biological cousins named Sebastian has been exploiting family connections and associated political ties with Trump energy to exploit my energy entirely against my consent to my detriment, making excuses that he has ADHD and probably egregiously misrepresenting me as also having ADHD, with absolutely zero real evidence and entirely against my consent. I've seen reason to suspect Sebastian is the strange, unidentifiable triangle of trust energy I previously was unclear of the identity of that was being purported through the Caroline energy, in the sense that Sebastian was actually in reality entirely himself manipulating three energies of different zodiac signs in order to attempt to push his own agendas through Caroline's energy entirely against my consent. In the interest of clarity, perhaps it's worth explicitly mentioning that the parents of the Caroline I once knew are different from those of the Sebastian I'm talking about. That Sebastian is the brother of the same Nicole I've previously mentioned extremely weird implications about me being made in relation to, since that whole family unit is now increasingly being revealed to me as violating my energy egregiously, with me even hearing that their father George and his wife also have been plotting a lot behind my back for a long time. I'll also mention that Nicole has a twin sister named Natalie, who I also have a very similar connection to as I have with Nicole. Also, I once recall Kristen sharing some extremely dark, strange thing with me that suggested to me he sexually violated Natalie and or Nicole when they were still babies, and I suspect he's involved in egregious defamation of me and misrepresentation of me through various means that attempts to frame me for doing some kind of pedophilic actions towards Natalie and or Nicole that in reality Kristen did. At this point, I suppose I should just outright explicitly state that I came to the conclusion of Sebastian's involvement through what I suspect to be heavily AI-related activity related to my official TikTok account. I intentionally removed all likes from that account long ago, and much more recently all my reposted videos as well. I've noticed on several occasions the TikTok platform automatically liking and or favoriting and or reposting videos from that account entirely against my consent, and I've been regularly checking to see if it keeps doing it and undoing it when it does. It's done such things several times, even as recently as within the last couple days. What really triggered me into even removing all my reposted videos was that it very recently even automatically force-followed an account from my account entirely against my consent, which I proceeded to promptly unfollow as soon as I noticed it had happened shortly after waking up today. I now see extremely good reason to believe that extremely strange behavior has been occurring as a direct result of egregious defamation of me and ultimately also much more serious and very much criminal activity targeting me coming from those I once called family. I noticed egregious violations of my energy extremely vaguely relating to sports shortly after my last release on this podcast. It was sustained for a quite substantial period of time, several hours that followed. This, to me, suggests that there's been a heavy, egregious violation of my energy being exploited to pass one or more of the 3 executive orders that I mentioned in the last release on this podcast, and I know that personally because I've never had any particular interest in or care for any sport or sport-related things in my entire life, whether on a professional level or an amateur level. That's also why I haven't bothered to try debating or feeling any particularly negative feelings towards Stephen or Destiny because of what I saw to be an inadequately meticulous stance on trans people in relation to professional sports. I've seen reason to suspect that Vivian and or her brother Dean might have something to do with this sports-related energetic violation of me. I now find it worth noting that my stance on the 3 executive orders that I mentioned in relation to Trump is a stance I take from a fundamental, principled place entirely independent of any external source. To provide some context, I got a brief summary of each executive order from ChatGPT when asking about Donald Trump and his views on trans people. I evaluated things based purely on objective critical thinking, not any subjective feelings towards Trump and or anyone else. If it becomes apparent to me that for some reason I should elaborate in meticulous detail what my stance on the specific wording of each executive order is, then perhaps I'll put more research into it and provide a more meticulous rhetoric around it. But for now, I consider my more summary analysis adequate to establish that I maintain an overall neutral stance on Trump and all other presidents of countries and high-ranking government officials in general, as far as I feel any need to publicly address them. Again, I'm really not trying to get heavily involved in politics, and I'm really not trying to make myself a target for professional hitmen being sent after me by extremely powerful world leaders like Trump. Further, I'm hearing there are ongoing egregious lies going around that I'm dating and or particularly interested in some kind of romantic and or sexual relations with people that I in reality do not, never have, and never will have, or even tolerate serious attempts to force me to pretend to have any position contradicting the reality of me having absolutely no such feelings, desires, or intentions towards, perhaps specifically, white, black, and brown-skinned people. This isn't any kind of discriminatory stance on any ethnicity in a general sense. It's simply refuting any notions of me having particular romantic and or sexual interest in them, which everyone is entitled to their own personal preferences regarding and fully valid in enforcing extremely firmly as long as they're always upfront and honest about it, like I've been very much so on this podcast. Like I've said many times before, I'm particularly romantically and sexually attracted to Asian women, especially Korean women, not individuals of any gender and or sex from any other ethnicity. And as far as specifically the skin tone or color that I prefer, it's a pale white like that of Kimmy's skin, not tanned or darker to any extent for any reason, even on Asian women of any specific Asian ethnicity. Nobody has been asking me if I have someone special in my life or clearly displaying serious romantic and or sexual desires towards me, and I haven't been trying to secretly date and or otherwise pursue any kind of romantic and or sexual relations with anyone. I would never begin dating anyone in any capacity to any extent without first explicitly expressing extremely clear, irrefutable sexual interest in them, completely consistent with my sexual preferences I've already explicitly described on this podcast publicly. The only person I've ever actually shown any such sexual interest in at this point is Kimmy, and perhaps in some theoretical universe where Chloe Chen hadn't treated me how I'm absolutely convinced she in reality has, also her. At this time, absolutely nobody in the entire world other than Kimmy has any even remotely adequate reason to believe I have any even remotely adequate sexual attraction towards them for me to have any desire and or willingness at all to tolerate any kind of romantic and or sexual relations with them ever under any circumstances. And even then, even Kimmy's doomed if she's actually pregnant and sees that pregnancy through instead of getting an abortion, entirely regardless of how long she might have already been pregnant for, or who she got pregnant by, or how, or why. And there's absolutely nothing and nobody that has any real ability to change that, nor do I or will I ever have any desire and or willingness to tolerate any attempts to do so. I find it worth mentioning that I don't have any particular fixations with poetry in any context to any extent. I most certainly do not consent to attempts to frame events occurring in my life as somehow coordinated by me or anyone else at all operating with my consent or best interests to be somehow poetic in any capacity to any extent for any reason. I consider attempts to falsely frame my reality otherwise as intended to cause an extremely destructive rapid downward spiral or a snowball effect in my life. I suspect it to be related to the same kinds of egregiously false narratives about me that may have ultimately led to Kimmy feeling so extremely traumatized in life and so grossly inappropriately blaming me for that trauma that it possibly single-handedly necessitated her to get her cat Snowball just to even retain her sanity. I have been hearing that Kimmy has been egregiously lying about the fact that she made me feel like she extremely firmly rejected me and refused to actually properly, healthily deepen our connection when I completely sincerely brought it up to her to get closer and actually start dating. And she's been instead lying that it was my idea and intent to distance myself from her and pursue other people as if I never even wanted to date her and never was even seriously romantically and sexually attracted to her, trying to make me seem like I've been exceedingly fake and cruel in all the times I've been admitting to the extremely intense sexual physical attraction I felt towards her for a very long time. I'm hearing she was exploiting that so extremely badly that she was intentionally trying to block me from ever having romantic and or sexual relations with anyone else as a result, and even friendships in general. I imagine this energy extends as far back as Chloe also doing this kind of egregious violation of my boundaries, energy, and existence before I ever even met Kimmy to try to block me from ever having the kind of connection with Kimmy that Chloe must have known completely clearly I'd obviously extremely deeply crave and pursue extremely intensely with completely sincere and otherwise completely obvious intent if it wasn't for her egregiously criminal interference in my life that was trying to block and destroy my blessings for her own selfish gain. She was pursuing fully consciously and intentionally entirely against my consent to my detriment. While I certainly question the extent of malice Kimmy might have had in her behavior having this kind of effect on me, and I currently feel basically completely uncertain of how Kimmy might have behaved towards me in relation to that aspect if it wasn't for Chloe's egregious defamation of me to Lily and others that essentially sabotaged my connection with Kimmy before Kimmy ever really even had a chance to get to know me. I have absolutely zero doubt in my mind that Chloe was egregiously disrespecting and neglecting me and unapologetically betraying me so she could keep Jerry and Herman comfortable and feel more important than me. There's literally no apology Chloe could ever give me to fix that, especially with how egregiously unapologetic and blatantly obvious she's made it to me, entirely regardless of how anyone, certainly including Jerry and Herman, might ever try to portray it. Beyond even both Kimmy and Chloe, it seems it's only becoming increasingly apparent to me that Mary has actually been involved in much more serious, egregious defamation of me than I ever had any clear reason to suspect her of in the past, which I assert I will always, only unwaveringly, explicitly maintain, has always in reality been occurring entirely against my consent. I see reason to suspect that, most likely through egregious defamation of me through Kristen, a part of the reason for Chloe's and Kimmy's malicious behavior towards me has been because of highly immoral things that Mary has been doing behind the scenes to sabotage and destroy my life in order to cover up how egregiously abusive Mary in reality always was to me, and therefore the real reasoning why I left her house how I did and ended up ever getting mixed into all the chaos with Dixon and John and stuff, how that all unfolded. I'm hearing Mary's egregiously lying that she herself can do something like what I've done with this podcast. In the same breath, for reasons unclear to me beyond the fact that she's being extremely deceptive for selfish gain entirely at my expense against my consent, she's lying that I saved her life, and or she's lying that I'd ever actually want, need, and or ever attempt to save her life at all. After all the abuse, disrespect, and neglect she's forced me to suffer enduring as a direct consequence of her attitude and behavior towards me the entire time she was in my life. While I might have once found it appropriate to try to protect Mary from Dixon after hearing how she victimized herself, that time has long passed already. Seeing how unapologetically she abused me to the point I felt Dixon couldn't be much worse, combined with seeing how she specifically went out of her way to call him while I was present over a decade ago when I first left her house to go live with Dixon, and I personally witnessed hearing her talk to him and egregiously slandering me, calling me a drug addict, to which Dixon showed skepticism of her claims, I'm absolutely convinced that Mary intentionally was trying to sabotage my connection with Dixon all along, which leaves me with serious room to question if Dixon would have acted how he did to me in the first place had Mary not estranged me from him for much of my childhood after the separation and ultimately divorce between them. I firmly believe Mary never wanted me to even be able to really find out the truth, especially when considering how she tried to manipulate and coercively control me. When I first brought up contacting Dixon to her, since her abuse had reached intolerable heights, after she'd even dragged John into the whole thing with how Chloe's blatantly racist rejection of me ended up traumatizing me extremely badly, and on top of that, getting me suspended from high school for the one and only time I was ever suspended from any school in my entire life. To make things even more confusing, I saw reason to suspect that Dixon and John have some kind of drug-related business connection through complex political ties, indicating to me that both Dixon and John were intentionally collaborating with each other and also Mary in order to exploit me from a very young age. Both Dixon and Mary are exceedingly shady to me and seem to me like they both wanted to sabotage my connection with both of them and leave me in chaos and darkness and never able to actually firmly blame either of them, but also never really have any confidence to embrace warmth from or towards either of them either. It seems to me that as a result of various factors that in no short measure involve those I've just addressed in this release, there appears to be egregious false narratives through spirituality that I want some kind of surprise, essentially something I haven't in reality actually been working towards or even really want at all, to receive something that extremely clearly, blatantly, egregiously compromises my integrity and authenticity that I've established on this podcast. This, by extension, would discredit and invalidate all the authority I would have proven myself to fully deserve to exercise as a result of that integrity and authenticity I've displayed, leaving me vulnerable to the ongoing conspiracy and attempts to murder me that I continue to this day to be subjected to entirely against my consent to my detriment. A further consequence of all this egregious misrepresentation of the reality of my life seems to be that Lily's energy perceives a polar opposite reality of when it's actually day and night for me, most recently wishing me good night when in reality it was still bright and early in the day. I find this quite concerning, since if Kimmy's energy has been operating through Lily's energy and Kimmy's energy has been attacking me during the night, this might mean I'm now susceptible to conspiracy and attempted murder during broad daylight as a direct consequence of the malice of those I've listed previously. I've been hearing things about people being involved in running full-on scams for selfish financial gain, very possibly exploiting my name and reputation behind the scenes in a manner I assert I will always only continue to reinforce, providing evidence has only ever been occurring entirely against my consent to my detriment, and intentionally kept as hidden as possible from me for as long as they all possibly thought they could hide it from me. That brings to mind one time I heard John assert he believed me to be running some kind of scam, trying to collect donations for some kind of video game development in some weird context, and then not producing results I'd promised in return for receiving those donations. I've most certainly never done such a thing. The only time I've ever received any kind of donation as a result of my video game development endeavors was many years ago when I initially started streaming on Twitch. I got a grand total of under $50 from a few random viewers who I had never made any promises to about anything, and I was under the impression I received that money from them with absolutely no indebtedness to them whatsoever for it. I was living at Dixon's house at the time I was streaming on Twitch during that roughly week and a half that I got that money within. The same period, I got almost 200 followers in a very short period of time, and that Dixon made a mockery of and told me I was wasting my time in my efforts when I tried to explain to him I was able to produce results that prove my potential is immense and I deserve a chance to keep going and starting a business and a great future for myself with the resources Dixon was providing me by letting me live in his house and eat food he'd buy for me. He trivially dismissed the impressive social media growth, he trivially dismissed the financial results, and he continued to relentlessly bully me and blame me for Kristen's extreme laziness, carelessness, and overall extremely spoiled, pretentious, and complacent attitude that Mary had fostered in how she'd always extremely abusively pick fights with me and hardly ever gave Kristen any hassle in comparison.